She thought she was helping someone in need. What she didn't know was that she had just invited a killer into her home. On a quiet Tuesday evening in March 2023, 26-year-old Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of her modest ranch-style home in rural Indiana, looking at the man who had just knocked on her door. He was maybe in his late 30s, with tired eyes and a disheveled appearance that suggested he'd been through something difficult. His story seemed simple enough. His car had broken down about a mile up the road, his phone was dead, and he just needed to make a quick call for a tow truck. It was the kind of situation that happens in small-town America every day. The kind of moment where you have to make a split-second decision about whether to help a stranger or protect yourself. For Sarah, a substitute teacher who had grown up in this tight-knit community of fewer than 3,000 people, the choice seemed obvious. This was Indiana, after all, a place where neighbors still helped neighbors, where church communities rallied around those in need, where turning away someone in trouble felt almost un-American. "Sure, come on in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "My phone's in the kitchen." What Sarah couldn't have known, what she had no way of knowing, was that the man stepping into her home that evening was Marcus Henderson, a recently released convict with a past so dark that even the parole board had been reluctant to let him out. She couldn't have known that his car breakdown story was a lie, carefully crafted and repeated at 3 other houses before hers. She couldn't have known that he had been watching her neighborhood for 2 days, taking notes on who lived alone, who had security systems, who seemed most likely to open their door to a stranger in distress. She couldn't have known that she had exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes left to live. But let's back up, because Sarah's story, and the tragedy that would unfold in her home that night, didn't really begin when she opened her door. It began 6 weeks earlier, when a series of bureaucratic failures and systemic oversights set a dangerous man free to walk the streets with almost no supervision and even less accountability. Marcus Henderson had been in and out of the criminal justice system since he was 16 years old. His record read like a disturbing escalation pattern that any criminologist could have predicted would eventually lead to violence. Petty theft at 16, breaking and entering at 19, assault at 23, aggravated assault at 27, each crime a little worse than the last, each sentence a little longer, each parole violation a red flag that the system somehow failed to notice or failed to care about. His most recent conviction had been for armed robbery and assault. He had held up a gas station in Fort Wayne, pistol-whipping the clerk so badly that the young man required reconstructive facial surgery. The sentence was 12 years. He served 7. When Henderson walked out of the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City on January 15, 2023, he had exactly $340 in his pocket, a halfway house assignment that he would skip within 2 weeks, and a parole officer managing a caseload so large that monthly check-ins had become more of a formality than actual supervision. He also had something else, a burning resentment that had festered during his years behind bars, a toxic mix of entitlement and rage that made him believe the world owed him something for the time he'd lost. But we'll return to Henderson's path in a moment. First, let's talk about Sarah, because she deserves to be more than just a victim in this story. She deserves to be remembered as a person, a young woman with dreams, fears, quirks, and a life that mattered long before it intersected with a predator's plans. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell grew up in the same Indiana town where she would later die. She was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between an older brother who became a Marine and a younger sister studying veterinary medicine at Purdue. Her parents, both retired school teachers, had raised their children with Midwestern values: work hard, help others, trust your community, and always lock your doors at night. That last lesson, ironically, was the one Sarah had been struggling with lately. Just 3 months before her death, Sarah had gone through a difficult breakup with her boyfriend of 4 years, Tyler Bennett. They had been high school sweethearts, the kind of couple everyone assumed would get married right after college. But Tyler had gotten a job offer in Chicago, and Sarah wasn't ready to leave her hometown, her aging parents, or the familiar comfort of a place where everyone knew her name. The relationship had ended not with drama or betrayal, but with the quiet sadness of two people wanting different things from life. After the breakup, Sarah had moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Tyler and into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It was a charming place, built in the 1970s, with a big backyard and a front porch perfect for summer evenings. But it was also isolated. The nearest neighbor was about 200 yards away, hidden behind a line of oak trees. The landlord had offered her a good deal on the rent, probably because the isolation made it hard to find tenants, especially single women. Sarah's friends had worried about her living alone. Her mother had insisted on installing better locks and leaving a can of pepper spray in every room. Her father had even suggested getting a dog for protection, but Sarah had laughed off their concerns. This was Indiana, not New York City. This was a town where the most exciting crime report in the local paper was usually teenagers tipping over mailboxes or someone's Christmas decorations getting stolen. "I'll be fine," she had told her mother just 2 weeks before her death. "Nothing ever happens here." She had no way of knowing that Marcus Henderson was already in town, already watching, already planning. Henderson's pattern of behavior in those weeks after his release follows a trajectory that criminal psychologists have documented hundreds of times. He wasn't a sophisticated criminal mastermind. He was something perhaps more dangerous. An opportunistic predator with just enough cunning to exploit the basic human desire to help others, combined with just enough desperation to escalate to violence when things didn't go his way. After skipping his halfway house in late January, Henderson had drifted through northern Indiana, staying in cheap motels when he had money and sleeping in his car when he didn't. He supported himself through a combination of panhandling, petty theft, and occasional odd jobs that he would abandon after a few days. He was looking for something, though he probably couldn't have articulated exactly what. An opportunity, a score, a way to get enough money to disappear somewhere new and start over. Or maybe he was looking for something else entirely. Maybe he was looking for a way to make someone else feel the powerlessness he had felt in prison. Maybe he was looking for control. We know from his later confession that Henderson first drove through Sarah's neighborhood on March 12th, 6 days before her murder. He had been exploring rural areas outside the main town, looking for homes that seemed vulnerable. No security system signs in the yard, no dogs barking behind fences, cars that suggested single occupants rather than families. Sarah's house checked all those boxes. Over the next few days, Henderson watched. He learned Sarah's routine, saw her leave for work in the morning and return in the late afternoon. He noted that she often stayed up late with her lights on, probably watching TV or reading. He observed that she sometimes forgot to lock her car in the driveway. He saw, in other words, all the small vulnerabilities that most of us have in our daily lives. The little moments of carelessness that usually mean nothing, but can sometimes mean everything. What he couldn't see, what he couldn't know from watching through the trees at a distance, was that Sarah had been increasingly anxious lately. Her best friend Jessica would later tell police that Sarah had mentioned feeling creeped out by a car she kept seeing parked down the road. She had even joked about it, calling herself paranoid, laughing about how living alone was making her imagine things. "I'm turning into one of those nervous people who jumps at every sound," Sarah had texted Jessica 2 days before her death. "Next thing you know, I'll be calling the cops about squirrels on my roof, LLL." But it wasn't paranoia. The car she had noticed was Henderson's beat-up Honda Civic. Her instincts had been trying to tell her something. The problem was that in a society that often tells women they're being overly cautious, overly fearful, overly suspicious, Sarah had talked herself out of trusting those instincts. So when Marcus Henderson knocked on her door on the evening of March 18th with his story about a broken-down car and a dead cell phone, Sarah made the decision that so many of us would make. She chose kindness over caution. She chose to believe in the basic goodness of strangers. She chose to help. She opened the door. What Sarah didn't know was that the moment Marcus Henderson crossed her threshold, he had already made his decision about how this encounter would end. "Thanks so much," Henderson said as he stepped into the small foyer, his voice carrying that particular tone of grateful humility that predators learn to perfect. "I really appreciate this. My phone died about an hour ago, and I've been walking forever." Sarah closed the door behind him, not locking it, just pushing it shut, and gestured toward the kitchen. "No problem. Phone's on the counter. Help yourself." The layout of Sarah's rental house was simple and open. From the front door, you could see directly into the living room, which flowed into the kitchen area. A short hallway to the right led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It was cozy, decorated with the kind of mass-produced farmhouse chic that filled every home goods store in America. Wooden signs with inspirational quotes, woven baskets, throw pillows with geometric patterns. The TV was on, some reality show playing at low volume, and there was a half-empty glass of white wine on the coffee table next to an open laptop. Henderson took all of this in with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating environments for vulnerability and opportunity. No alarm system panel by the door, no dog bowls or pet supplies, no men's shoes by the entrance. The laptop suggested she was comfortable here, settled in for the evening. The wine suggested she was relaxed, maybe not at peak alertness, and most importantly, they were completely alone. "Is it okay if I use the bathroom first?" Henderson asked, adding an embarrassed laugh. "Like I said, I've been walking for a while." "Oh, sure," Sarah said, pointing down the hallway. "First door on the left." Okay, this was the moment, the crucial 15 seconds, when everything could have gone differently. If Sarah had said no, insisted he make his call and leave, kept herself positioned between him and the exit. If she had trusted the tiny voice in her head that was probably screaming that something felt wrong about this situation. If she had noticed that he didn't actually smell like someone who'd been walking for miles in March weather, or that his shoes were barely scuffed, or that his hands weren't cold despite claiming he'd been outside in 40-degree temperatures. But Sarah didn't notice any of these things. She was a substitute teacher, not a detective. She was a kind person, raised in a community where helping strangers wasn't suspicious. It was expected. As Henderson walked down the hallway, Sarah moved into the kitchen and picked up her phone from the counter. She pulled up her recent texts, thinking she might let her friend Jessica know about the situation, not because she felt unsafe, but just as a funny anecdote about her evening. "Random guy just knocked on my door with car trouble, LOL. Living that exciting single life." She never sent that text, because at that moment, Henderson emerged from the hallway, but he wasn't heading to the kitchen to use the phone. He was moving quickly, purposefully, directly toward her. And he had a knife. Later, investigators would determine that Henderson had been carrying a folding knife in his jacket pocket, a weapon he'd stolen from a sporting goods store 3 days earlier. It wasn't a particularly large or intimidating knife, just a standard 4-inch blade. But in the hands of someone who intended to use it, size didn't matter. Sarah saw him coming, saw the blade. Her brain processed the transformation from helpless stranger to immediate threat in the span of a heartbeat. The phone dropped from her hand, clattering on the kitchen tile. "Don't scream," Henderson said, his voice completely different now, hard, controlled, stripped of the grateful humility from 30 seconds ago. "Don't make a sound, or I will kill you right now. Do you understand? What goes through someone's mind in a moment like this? Psychologists who study trauma say that the human brain has three primary responses to mortal danger: fight, flight, or freeze. Sarah's response in that instant was to freeze. Her body locked up, her breathing stopped, her mind went blank with terror. Henderson closed the distance between them in 2 steps. He grabbed her arm, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to hurt, and pressed the knife against her side. "Where's your purse?" he demanded. "Where do you keep your money? Your cards?" Sarah couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. She managed to lift one shaking hand and point toward the living room, where her purse sat on the couch. Henderson dragged her toward it, keeping the knife pressed against her ribs. With his free hand, he grabbed the purse and dumped its contents onto the couch cushions. Wallet, keys, tampons, lip gloss, receipts, all the mundane debris of a person's life scattered like evidence of normalcy about to be shattered. He flipped open the wallet. 3 20s, a 10, and some ones. Maybe $75 total. His jaw tightened. "This is it?" he said. $70 fucking. "There's more," Sarah managed to whisper, finding her voice through the terror. "In my bedroom, I have about 300 in my nightstand. You can have it. Just take it and go, please." This was Sarah's first strategic thought, her brain beginning to function beyond pure panic. Give him what he wants. Let him take the money and leave. Survive this. She had no way of knowing that for Marcus Henderson, this had never been just about money. For 7 years in prison, Henderson had been powerless. For 7 years, he had been told when to eat, when to sleep, when to shower. For 7 years, he had been nothing but a number in an orange jumpsuit, subject to the whims of guards and the violence of other inmates. And now, in this moment, holding a knife against a terrified young woman in her own home, he was experiencing something he had been craving since the day he got out: complete and total control. The money was secondary. The power was the point. "Show me," he said, shoving her toward the hallway. Sarah stumbled forward, Henderson right behind her, the knife never leaving her side. They moved down the short hallway, past the bathroom where he'd pretended to go, past the guest bedroom she used for storage, to her bedroom at the end of the hall. It was a small room, feminine and personal. The bed was unmade from that morning. There were clothes draped over a chair in the corner, photos on the dresser, Sarah with her family, Sarah with friends, Sarah and Tyler from happier times. A life frozen in images, about to be destroyed. "The nightstand," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Top drawer." Henderson kept one hand gripping her arm while he yanked open the drawer with the other. Inside, exactly as she'd said, was a small stack of 20s, her emergency cash, money she'd been saving in case her car broke down or she needed something urgent. He grabbed it, shoving it into his pocket. Then he looked around the room, at the jewelry box on the dresser, at the laptop in the living room, at Sarah herself, and he made a decision that would transform this from a robbery into something far worse. "Sit on the bed," he ordered. "You have the money," Sarah said, her voice rising with fresh panic. "You have everything. Please just go. I won't call the police. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Just please leave." But Henderson wasn't listening. He was looking at her with an expression that Sarah would later describe, in the precious few minutes she had left, as empty. Not angry, not lustful, just empty. Like she wasn't a person to him, like she was just an object, an opportunity, a thing he could use. "I said sit down," he repeated, raising the knife. This was the moment when Sarah's survival instinct finally overrode her freeze response. This was when she understood, with absolute clarity, that compliance would not save her. That this man had no intention of just taking the money and leaving. That if she sat down on that bed, she would never stand up again. So she did the only thing she could do. She ran. Sarah twisted hard to the left, breaking free from Henderson's grip. She bolted toward the bedroom door, her only thought to get to the front door, to get outside, to scream for help. She almost made it. Henderson lunged after her, catching the back of her shirt just as she reached the hallway. The fabric tore as she tried to pull away, and for one desperate second she thought she might break free. But then his hand was in her hair, yanking her backward with such force that she felt strands rip from her scalp. She screamed then, a raw, primal sound of terror and pain. In a different neighborhood, in a different house, someone might have heard. Someone might have called 911. But Sarah's nearest neighbor was 200 yards away, behind a line of oak trees, probably watching TV with the volume up. No one heard. Henderson slammed her against the hallway wall, hard enough that her head bounced off the drywall and left a small dent. Stars exploded in her vision. She felt the knife at her throat now, the cold metal pressing against her skin. "That was stupid," Henderson said, breathing hard. "That was really fucking stupid." What happened in Sarah Mitchell's home over the next 4 hours would later be described by the lead detective as one of the most prolonged and terrorizing ordeals he had encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. But we need to be careful here. We need to remember that Sarah was a real person, not just a victim in a crime report. And while the details of what Marcus Henderson did to her are part of the public record, documented in police reports, autopsy findings, and court testimony, recounting every moment of her suffering serves no one. Not Sarah's memory, not her family, not you, the person trying to understand how something like this could happen. What we can say is this: Henderson kept Sarah alive far longer than he needed to. For the first hour, she tried everything. She begged. She reasoned. She offered him more money, her car, anything he wanted. She told him about her family, her students, her life, trying desperately to make him see her as a human being rather than an object. Psychologists call this humanization strategy, and in some cases, it works. Hostages have talked their way out of death by making their captors see them as people. But Marcus Henderson had spent 7 years in a place where seeing others as people was a survival disadvantage. Prison had taught him that empathy was weakness, that connection was vulnerability, that the only way to protect yourself was to stop caring about anyone else's humanity. Sarah's words meant nothing to him. By the second hour, Sarah had stopped talking. The fight-or-flight response that had surged through her body earlier had burned out, leaving her in a state that trauma experts call tonic immobility, a neurological shutdown where the body essentially plays dead in the face of inescapable danger. She was conscious but disconnected, her mind retreating to somewhere safer while her body endured what was happening to it. Henderson, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. The initial rush of power and control was wearing off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety about what came next. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Even if he left now, Sarah could identify him. She knew his face, could describe him to police, could put him back in prison for the rest of his life. He began pacing through the house, looking through Sarah's belongings with a manic energy. He ate food from her refrigerator. He drank from her vodka bottle. He went through her laptop, her mail, her personal documents, as if searching for something, though he probably couldn't have said what. What he was really doing was working up the courage to finish what he'd started. At some point during the third hour, police would later estimate around 9:45 p.m., based on digital evidence, Henderson used Sarah's laptop to search for information about how long DNA evidence could survive, how police traced crimes, what kind of evidence could connect a suspect to a victim. The search history would later be crucial in the prosecution's case, showing premeditation and consciousness of guilt. But it would also show something else: Henderson's complete technological incompetence. He didn't use incognito mode. He didn't clear the browser history. He searched from his victim's own computer, in her own home, creating a perfect digital trail of his intentions. This wasn't a criminal mastermind. This was a desperate, violent man who had watched too many crime shows and thought he knew how to get away with murder. Sarah regained some awareness during the fourth hour. Henderson had left her in the bedroom while he continued his frantic movements through the house. She could hear him opening and closing drawers, moving furniture, talking to himself in a low, agitated voice. This was when Sarah did something extraordinary. Something that would later help investigators understand exactly what had happened in her final hours. Something that showed she never completely gave up hope, even in the darkest moment of her life. She managed to text her best friend Jessica. Her phone had fallen on the kitchen floor when Henderson first pulled the knife, but at some point he had picked it up and tossed it onto the bedroom dresser, probably while he was ransacking the room for valuables. Sarah, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type, reached for it. The text she sent at 10:17 p.m. was brief. Help! Just one word. 4 letters. But it was enough. Jessica Morgan had been Sarah's best friend since 7th grade. They had grown up together, survived high school together, been each other's bridesmaids in waiting. Jessica knew Sarah's texting style, knew her sense of humor, knew that Sarah wasn't the kind of person to send dramatic one-word texts without context. Something was wrong. Jessica immediately tried calling. The phone rang in Sarah's bedroom, the screen lighting up with Jessica's contact photo. Henderson, still in the living room, heard the ringtone and came running. He saw Sarah holding the phone, saw Jessica's name on the screen, and something in him snapped. "What did you do?" he screamed, ripping the phone from her hands. "What the fuck did you do?" He stared at the screen, at the single word Sarah had managed to send, and his face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, rage, panic, calculation. He knew what this meant. He knew that someone out there now knew something was wrong, that the clock was ticking, that he had to make a decision. The phone kept ringing. Henderson declined the call. Immediately, Jessica called back. He declined again. Then came a text from Jessica. "Sarah, what's wrong? Are you okay? Call me right now." Henderson turned off the phone and shoved it in his pocket. Then he turned to Sarah with an expression that she would later describe, in the brief moments she remained conscious, as resigned. He had made his decision. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Jessica Morgan was making her own decision. She had tried calling Sarah 4 more times, each call going straight to voicemail now. She had sent 6 texts, all undelivered. And with each passing minute, the knot of anxiety in her stomach grew tighter. Jessica knew about Sarah living alone, knew about the isolated house, knew that Sarah had mentioned feeling creeped out by a car she kept seeing in her neighborhood. And she knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from knowing someone for half your life, that something was very, very wrong. At 10:31 p.m., Jessica called 911. "I need to report. I don't know what to report exactly," Jessica said to the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "My best friend just texted me the word help, and now she's not answering her phone, and I'm really scared something bad is happening." The dispatcher, a veteran named Linda Chen, who had worked the emergency line for 12 years, heard something in Jessica's voice that made her pay attention. Panic calls were common, but this was different. This was specific fear based on specific knowledge of a specific person. "What's your friend's name and address?" Chen asked, already flagging a deputy for dispatch. Jessica gave her the information. Within 90 seconds, Deputy Marcus Reeves was en route to Sarah Mitchell's address. Lights off to avoid alerting anyone inside. Estimated arrival time 8 minutes. But 8 minutes was 7 minutes and 43 seconds too long. Back in Sarah's bedroom, Henderson was making his final preparations. He had found duct tape in a kitchen drawer and used it to bind Sarah's wrists and ankles. He had searched the house for any other phones or devices she might use to call for help. He had turned off all the lights, except for one lamp in the bedroom, and then he had picked up the knife again. "I'm sorry," he said to Sarah, and the terrible thing was that he might have actually meant it. "I don't have a choice. You understand that, right? I can't go back to prison, I can't." Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper, said the last words she would ever speak to another human being. Please, my family, please." Henderson didn't respond. He had already disconnected, already convinced himself that what he was about to do was somehow necessary, somehow justified, somehow not really his fault. The prison system had failed him. Society had failed him. He was the victim here, really, if you thought about it the right way. This is what predators tell themselves. This is how they transform from people into monsters. Not through some dramatic transformation, but through a series of small moral compromises, each one making the next one easier, until murder becomes somehow acceptable in their twisted internal logic. At 10:34 p.m., Marcus Henderson committed the act that would end Sarah Mitchell's life. The medical examiner would later determine that death was not instantaneous, that Sarah had survived for several minutes after the initial attack, bleeding out on her bedroom floor while Henderson frantically tried to clean up evidence, his hands shaking, his breathing ragged, the reality of what he had done finally crashing down on him. At 10:39 p.m., Deputy Marcus Reeves pulled up to Sarah's house, lights still off. The house was mostly dark. Nothing looked obviously wrong from the outside. But Reeves had learned to trust his instincts over 20 years in law enforcement, and every instinct was screaming at him that something was very wrong here. He radioed for backup and approached the house on foot, hand on his weapon. The front door was slightly ajar. Deputy Marcus Reeves had been a law enforcement officer long enough to know that an open door at 10:39 p.m. on a welfare check call was never a good sign. He drew his weapon and spoke into his radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, I'm at 4247 Oakwood Lane. Front door is open. I'm making entry. ETA on backup?" 4 minutes out, came the response. 4 minutes. Reeves made a decision that would later be scrutinized by investigators, debated by his superiors, and ultimately deemed justified. He couldn't wait. If someone inside was injured and bleeding out, 4 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. "I'm going in," he said, and pushed the door open wider. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy, wrong. A lamp was on in what appeared to be the living room, casting long shadows across the floor. Reeves could see a purse dumped on the couch, its contents scattered, wallet, keys, receipts, signs of a struggle, or at least a search. "Sheriff's Department," Reeves called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Anyone here needs to make themselves known right now." Nothing. No response. Just that terrible, pressing silence. Reeves moved deeper into the house, weapon raised, every sense on high alert. Training took over, check corners, clear rooms, watch for ambush points. The living room was empty. The kitchen showed signs of recent activity, a broken wine glass on the floor, dark stains on the tile that made his stomach clench. Then he saw the hallway, and the blood trail leading down it. "Jesus," Reeves whispered. He keyed his radio again. "Dispatch, I need that backup now. And send an ambulance. We've got blood, significant amount." He followed the trail down the hallway, his heart pounding. The first door on the left, bathroom, was empty. The second door led to what looked like a storage room. But at the end of the hall, the bedroom door stood open, and that's where the blood trail led. Reeves reached the doorway and looked inside. Sarah Mitchell lay on the floor beside her bed, her body motionless in a spreading pool of blood. Her wrists and ankles were bound with duct tape. Even from the doorway, Reeves could see that she wasn't breathing, but he also saw something else that made his blood run cold. The bedroom window was open, curtain fluttering in the night breeze. Fresh scuff marks on the windowsill. The killer had just left. Maybe seconds ago. Maybe he was still on the property. Reeves spun around, weapon raised, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. He backed out of the bedroom, scanning the hallway, the rooms he'd already cleared. Had the killer been hiding, watching him move through the house, waiting for an opportunity to... A sound outside, movement in the backyard. Reeves moved quickly to a window and saw a figure running across the dark lawn, heading toward the tree line. Male, medium height, dark jacket. Suspect fleeing on foot, heading east into the woods behind the property, Reeves shouted into his radio. White male, 30s, dark clothing. I'm in pursuit. He should have stayed with the victim. Protocol said to secure the scene, check for signs of life, begin emergency aid. But Sarah Mitchell was clearly beyond help, and the person who had killed her was getting away. Reeves made another split-second decision and ran for the back door. By the time he reached the backyard, Henderson had a 30-second head start and the advantage of darkness. Reeves could hear him crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping, but visibility was almost zero under the tree canopy. "Stop! Sheriff's Department, stop or I will shoot!" Henderson didn't stop. If anything, he ran faster, pure panic driving him forward. He had seen the police car pull up, had been in the middle of trying to clean up evidence when he heard the deputy's voice echoing through the house. He had barely managed to squeeze through the bedroom window and drop to the ground before the deputy reached Sarah's body. Now he was running blind through woods he didn't know, in darkness, with an armed cop somewhere behind him. Every worst-case scenario from his 7 years in prison was flashing through his mind. Getting caught. Going back. This time forever. This time for murder. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Behind him, Reeves was following the sounds of Henderson's flight, but it was getting harder. The woods were dense, the terrain unfamiliar even to someone who'd patrolled this area for years. And then, suddenly, the sound stopped. Reeves froze, listening. Had Henderson stopped? Was he hiding, waiting to ambush him? Then came the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. Backup was arriving. Reeves keyed his radio. "Suspect is in the woods east of the property. I've lost visual. We need to set up a perimeter now before he gets to a road." Over the next 30 minutes, 6 more deputies arrived. They established a perimeter around the wooded area, brought in K9 units, set up spotlights, but Marcus Henderson had vanished into the Indiana night. Back at Sarah's house, the crime scene team was documenting what would become one of the most clear-cut murder cases in county history. The evidence was everywhere. Henderson's fingerprints on surfaces throughout the house, DNA under Sarah's fingernails from where she'd fought back, the search history on her laptop, and most damning of all, Sarah's phone, still in Henderson's jacket pocket, forgotten in his panic to escape. He had left behind everything they needed to identify him, track him, and convict him. But first, they had to find him. Marcus Henderson lasted 36 hours as a fugitive. For a day and a half, he moved through rural Indiana like a ghost, stealing food from unlocked cars, sleeping in abandoned barns, avoiding main roads. He had no plan beyond survival, no endgame beyond staying free for one more hour, then another, then another. But he was leaving a trail, a stolen jacket from a clothesline, a broken window at a gas station. Security footage showing a disheveled man matching his description buying cigarettes with cash at 3 a.m. The police net was tightening. Detective Sarah Chen, lead investigator on the case, had assembled a task force within hours of Sarah Mitchell's murder. They had Henderson's full criminal record, his photo distributed to every law enforcement agency in 3 states, his parole officer providing details about his habits and associates. "He's not sophisticated," Chen told her team. "He's desperate and violent, but he's not smart. He'll make a mistake." Henderson made his mistake at 11:47 p.m. on March 20th, when he tried to carjack a vehicle at a rest stop outside Gary, Indiana. The driver was an off-duty police officer from Chicago who recognized Henderson from the news alerts. The confrontation lasted less than 2 minutes. Henderson pulled his knife. The officer pulled his gun. Henderson surrendered. Marcus Henderson's trial lasted 6 days. The verdict took 43 minutes. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, DNA, the search history on Sarah's laptop, her phone in his pocket, security footage tracking his movements before and after the murder, his own confession given in a moment of exhausted resignation 12 hours after his arrest. "I didn't mean to kill her," he told detectives. "It just happened." But the prosecution showed it didn't just happen. They presented a timeline of systematic predation, watching Sarah's house for days, lying to gain entry, escalating violence, prolonged torture, deliberate murder. This wasn't impulse. This was choice. On November 18, 2023, Henderson was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Sarah's family sat in the courtroom as the judge read the sentence. Her mother held a photo of Sarah from her college graduation, smiling, hopeful, alive. Her father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Her siblings wept quietly. Sarah Mitchell was 26 years old, the prosecutor said in her closing statement. She opened her door to help a stranger. That kindness cost her everything. In victim impact statements, Sarah's family spoke of holidays that would never be the same, of a future stolen, of grandchildren who would never exist. Jessica Morgan described losing her best friend, her sister, in all but blood. Henderson offered no apology. He sat silent, staring at the table. Today, he remains in the same Indiana state prison where he once served time for robbery. He will die there. Sarah Mitchell's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of helping strangers, about the vulnerability of living alone, about how quickly normal life can turn into nightmare. Her family established a foundation in her name, teaching personal safety and self-defense. But perhaps the real lesson is this: evil doesn't announce itself. It knocks on your door with a reasonable story and a helpless expression. It exploits our best qualities: kindness, empathy, the desire to help. And sometimes it destroys us for it. Sarah deserved better. She deserved the long, happy life she was planning. She deserved to find love again, to teach students who adored her, to grow old with her family. Instead, she got 4 hours and 17 minutes of terror, and a killer who will spend the rest of his life behind bars, which is more justice than many victims receive, but far less than Sarah deserved. Her story ends here, but her memory lives on in everyone who knew her, everyone who loved her, and everyone who learns from the tragedy of that March evening when she made the simple human choice to help someone in need. Rest in peace, Sarah Mitchell. You deserved so much more.